Medicare for All, the podcast for everyone who needs railroads.
What?
I know
Hold
you
on.
might be confused, Jillian. Usually it's the podcast for everyone who needs healthcare, but stick with me here. Usually we spend time on our podcast talking about our for-profit healthcare system, why we need to make healthcare a public good. But in this episode, we're going to take a little bit of a detour into another privatized American system that should be public, our railroad infrastructure. Just like in U.S. healthcare, private companies are kind of falling asleep at the switch on managing our railroad infrastructure. And just like in the healthcare system, also, the failure of big corporations is costing us money and also lives. So today, we're joined by a steering committee member of Railroad Workers United, a huge inter-union labor caucus of railroad workers from across the country that is fighting both for Medicare for All and for making our country's railroad infrastructure public. So we're going to talk about the parallels between those two fights, why railroad workers support Medicare for All, and why we think everyone who's passionate about Medicare for All should also be excited about establishing public railways in our country. Jillian, you want to introduce our guest for today?
Yes, I do. Our guest today is Michael Paul Lindsay, who goes by Paul. And Paul was a locomotive engineer for 17 years. And today he's joining us from California. Paul, so good to have you.
Morning.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me.
Paul, why don't we actually kick things off by with you telling us a little bit about yourself? How'd you first start working on the railroad? How'd you get involved with Railroad Workers United? Tell us all about you.
Well, I always wanted to work for the railroad. From the time I was a kid, I always wanted to be an engineer. And it was something that I pursued for a lot of years. Growing up, I was always fascinated with the history, and I could tell you all kinds of information about the railroads and their history and their development. I mean, all growing up, but it just continued going on working for them. I hired on in 2006 in California, and worked, all over the state, San Luis Obispo and Roseville up in the Sacramento area and the Bay Area and Oakland and quite a few different. But about the time that the financial crisis started to rear its head, our jobs started to be cut, traffic started to slow down, and they were looking for people to move out of state, transfer. So I ended up going to Pocatello, Idaho, of all places. And I don't know that it was the best place to go, but at the time it was what they offered. And they told me, oh yeah, you'll never get furloughed. We need people up there. Well, it turned out to be a bunch of liars, and I got furloughed up there for a while. And it's been a lot of years of fighting to develop my seniority. And with the way the railroads have been cutting and cutting and cutting for years and years and years, my seniority never really gets much better, unfortunately. I was finally able to work as an engineer after waiting my whole life. I was able to work as an engineer rather than a conductor. And now I'm not working because the railroad has retaliated against me for my published articles and my speaking to the news media, speaking on podcasts, and my TikTok channel that I called Calling Out Corruption. I just changed it to Railroad Refugee since I'm not down there anymore, and I'm just kind of traveling around in my camper and visiting. I got my, they retaliated against me, and I'm sure that we'll get that resolved at some point. But this is America. We believe in retaliating against whistleblowers. So.
Right.
Yes.
Sadly
yes.
so.
It's funny because last week on our podcast, we actually had Wendell Potter, who is a whistleblower from the healthcare industry. So he's made a whole career now out of being a whistleblower. Maybe you will do the same. Although I imagine you'd rather be back on the railroad.
Right.
I don't know. I'd rather travel and do that. I think that sounds like a good one.
It's probably more needed, to be honest.
Not bad. Very cool. And how did you end up getting involved with Railroad Workers United? Because I know that they're not a labor union per se, but a coalition of workers from different unions, right?
Yes, they're not a union. They are a coalition that tries to do what's good for the American railroad worker, as well as the industry, as well as just workers in general throughout the world, and to stand up against companies that believe that they're too big to fail, to stand up against these companies that would trample on unions and suppress collective bargaining and negotiations. And I mean, they're active in a lot of different directions. We're active in a lot of different directions, trying to get, like, for right now, legislation passed in different states regarding like trackside defect detectors, similar to what went on with the East Palestine, Ohio deal. There's a bill in Nevada right now that we played a part in getting, and it's been passed by the Assembly and the Senate, and it's on the governor's desk to get signed right now. We'll see whether he actually signs it, or a Republican governor. But but yeah. And I got involved in that when the labor dispute was going on, contract negotiations, and we were several years expired on our contract, and that's when I started to get heavily active with RW, because I was passionate and believing that we deserved more as employees.
Yeah, and speaking of contract negotiations, the reason that we at Medicare for All know about Railroad Workers United is that for many years, RW has been a supporter of Medicare for All to take healthcare off the bargaining table for railroad workers. And I know that there's a lot of different occupations represented in the railroad industry. Probably you all have different experiences with contract negotiations, but some railroad workers do have a hard time, getting access to decent healthcare. And I'm sure that the rail companies, like most large corporations in the United States, are constantly trying to shift healthcare costs onto workers or get them to slash other things to keep their benefits. So how do rising healthcare costs kind of impact railroad workers, at least from your perspective in the engineers union?
That's absolutely right, that they're constantly trying to use healthcare as a reason to cut into other benefits that we may have in the industry. We get gaslighted every time contract negotiations come up. They try to say that, well, our employees have gold-plated Cadillac health insurance, which really is not true. It's pretty standard health insurance, and it keeps going up in price. They keep making us pay more for it. But bottom line, they're gaslighting us into thinking that we're getting some awesome benefit, when in reality they're just using that to prevent us from negotiating for sick days, for better time off, for better work schedules, better work conditions, and they have held that over our head. Basically said, well, you're going to give up everything, quality of life and everything, or we're going to make you pay hundreds of dollars more a month for your health insurance. And that's the way negotiations always come up. I mean, I've seen contract negotiations come up every few years my whole career.
Yeah, it's incredible how. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that we see that in like every industry, right? In almost all of the industries where unions are with us, Medicare for All, one of the main reasons is because employers are able to use healthcare against workers in bargaining, and it's really it's immoral, and it's also just contrary to what we say we believe in this country, which is that if you work hard, you should have a decent life.
Yes, and it also it disproportionately gives these companies and these aren't like mom and pop entrepreneur types that we're talking about. We're talking major corporations, the ones that are too big to fail, the ones that BlackRock and Vanguard control. And these companies, it gives them disproportionately way more control over their employees. And really, I use the example that it puts employees almost into a state of indentured servitude, because how many people out there could be the next great writer, the next great inventor, the next great author, the next great anything, and they're like, I've got really big ideas, I'm going to go start a business, I'm going to do whatever. But then they look at it and go, but I can't risk losing my health insurance. So they just stay at their position their entire life. Or what about someone that doesn't necessarily want to go start a business or go do anything like that, but they could go and work for a competing company and maybe be treated better. But they stay at their same company because they don't want to lose their health insurance. And so, like talking with Europeans and people that I like I like traveling abroad, and speaking with some of these people, they enjoy a freedom that we don't enjoy in the United States, and that is that if your employer is being an asshole, you can just up and leave.
Right.
You can leave, and you're not going to lose your health insurance, and that gives the employees better bargaining, negotiating power, because that employer has to know at that point these people are not tied there by their health insurance.
Yeah, they call that job lock. The economists call it job lock, but I think the way you framed it is a basic economic freedom is even better. And I was just going to make fun of how the so-called Cadillac health insurance coverage that they call today is that 30 years ago would be like Yugo health insurance coverage, but now they call it Cadillac coverage. But anyway,
soon it's going to be Tesla coverage, and then
right? Yes.
Excellent. So let's just take back up for 1 second, because I think all right, I'm going to make a confession. When I think about railroads, I think about two things. I think about commuter rail, right? Because I've always lived in northeastern cities, right? And you need the Amtrak to be able to get around up and down the coast. And then I also think about just I have this old-timey image of railroads in my head, like, I don't know, hobos during the Great Depression, hopping boxcars and stuff like that. I think a lot of people don't realize just how critical railroads are to our modern economy, to our modern lifestyle, to the way that we do, the way that we do really everything in this country. Can you speak a little bit to that about why are railroads so important for us to be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, this is a piece of infrastructure that people don't hold on one second. Okay. So it's a piece of infrastructure that's in the background that people usually don't see personally. So they can't make comparisons. They see the trucks going down the road hauling the goods, but they don't see the grain and soda ash trains going down the rail a lot of the time. And so, for example, recently this year, there was an issue in California where Union Pacific was not delivering grain sufficient to Foster Farms, the largest chicken and turkey producer in the United States. And they were just days away from having to start slaughtering millions of chickens because the railroads weren't delivering. And they were blaming congestion and manpower shortages is what they were blaming, and locomotive shortages, even though they had been cutting their resources relentlessly so they could buy back more shares. So that is, you don't buy a live chicken from the store, so you're not having to deal in the raw commodity to feed that chicken. The rails, the ones provide, they're usually doing business with other businesses, and people don't realize how much is actually hauled, whether it has to do with chemicals, things like concrete. Concrete is one of those just low density, low cost commodities that's so heavy that you can't really move it very far economically. You can't move it far economically without rail. So your cement plants are going to be relatively nearby, and they're usually shipped in by rail. And you flat out could not have concrete at a reasonable price without rail. Same thing with commodities like soda ash that comes out of Wyoming that's used for fertilizer. That we've got one of the largest. We've got one of the largest supplies in the entire world in the United States of soda ash, and it would not make it to market if it relied on trucks and highways, because each one of those trains represents about 450 to 500 truckloads. Wow. There's simply not enough capacity. And our highways are, they're publicly owned and they're maintained using taxpayer dollars. And we should be looking long and hard at the amount of money that's wasted on share buybacks rather than putting it into the rail infrastructure, because every dollar that they use on share buybacks puts that reduces the cargo on rail. Every bit of capacity reduction will result in the taxpayer making up the difference, because that load will go to trucking and use a subsidized highway system. Wow. So it doesn't operate inside of a vacuum. Like the railroads seem to think that they do, though.
It seems like it's the railroads are really like the industry behind all the other industries, right? Like it's like the lifeblood that keeps it pumping. Yeah.
So it's crucial infrastructure for almost the whole economy to function. And this, I think what you were starting to get into is a good segue, because I wanted to ask you about how does the railway industry, how is it structured right now? Who are the players? Who owns the infrastructure and is responsible for maintaining it? And then who are the players who are actually operating the trains that are running on it? And how is it different in any way from, truck hauling and the highway system and flight and sort of alternative methods of transportation?
Yeah, so the railroads in this country have historically usually been private. Now there have been times in certain situations where that has not been the case. In fact, there was even one time during World War I that the railroads were kind of playing the game they're playing now, where they're trying to cut each other's throat and trying to not put money into their infrastructure. And then the First World War comes around, and then they couldn't haul the cargo. So during the First World War, we actually nationalized the U.S. rail system and took them under public ownership. And after the war ended, we returned them back to private ownership. But in the meantime, and in the meantime, we had forked out a tremendous amount of money in an entire class of locomotives and cars and standardization, all at taxpayers' expense, that we had given these railroads. And when they came out of that, the railroads were far more modern and financially viable going into the future. And they've been private, but ever since the 60s, especially the 50s and 60s, they started to merge and consolidate into bigger and bigger and bigger railroads, especially since we started to subsidize competition like the highway system, and the airlines were subsidized heavily. Not only just the big airports, but like these municipal airports in these communities. You look at it, we have municipal air service where maybe there's 2 or 3 flights a day. I guarantee you that airport is not profitable. They're not profitable without heavy subsidies, because 3 commercial flights a day won't. But yet everyone wants to talk about Amtrak and say, well, Amtrak needs to make a profit. Well, Amtrak, like the municipal airports, is one of those things that just will never be profitable. So if you go back to 1971, the railroads were in a really bad financial situation, especially some of the ones back in the Northeast that eventually ended up forming the Penn Central. They were like the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, and some of those Northeastern railroads were in really, really bad financial straits, as well as like the Milwaukee Road and the Rock Island and all of these companies that were going bankrupt. And at the time, they were still required to provide passenger service as a public service. And the government relieved them of that, created a quasi-government-owned corporation called Amtrak, and relieved them of their opportunity, or of their obligation. Of their obligation to provide this passenger service. And Amtrak has run the passenger service ever since, under the understanding that they would get the rights to run on these railroads' tracks, and they would be given priority. But now we've come to a point that the mergers have happened, especially going into the 80s and into the 90s. The mergers started to become super mergers. The Burlington Northern, the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific and the Western Pacific and the Missouri Pacific and the Rio Grande, all merging into these giant super mergers that essentially have the country divided into a duopoly where there is no competition. Very few cities are served by multiple railroads anymore, so there really is no competition. And because they have such dominant market power, they also don't give Amtrak any priority either, and they run their trains longer, and they don't have any sort of public vision believing that they are obligated to provide any sort of service. They have this idea that they are a private company that can do whatever they want, and that is the idea.
Even though the economy falls apart if they don't do their job. So
yes,
right,
yes, and even though that if they're going to be a monopoly, a common carrier, because last I checked, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Monopolies have been illegal in the United States for a very long time. And behaving like a monopoly in a market, you're supposed to have some obligations to work within the public interest.
Right.
That's what common carrier obligations were. But yeah, essentially the railroads don't believe they're subject to those anymore either.
So thinking about like kind of the consequences of that system, I guess, I think the whole country was watching in horror in February in Ohio this year when that train derailed. Obviously, it ended up being an incredibly expensive disaster. It had a huge environmental impact. There were toxic chemicals leaking into the soil, into the water, killing tens of thousands of wild animals and pets. And then, of course, on top of all that, like we're still waiting to see what the long-term health effects will be for people who have already started to experience symptoms of headaches and nausea and everything from all these chemicals they're exposed to. So what is that tragedy and some of the other tragedies that have been happening recently on the railroads? What does that tell us about the current system and how it's working or not working, as the case may be?
Well, it would definitely tell us that the system is not working, especially when in regards to the detectors. So what came about in the investigation, that is that the train went over several hot box detectors, trackside defect detectors, that scan the wheels as you go by. And you know, from working on the railroad, I can tell you I've worked with them for many, many years. You go over them and they announce an audible message over the radio, and it at the end, it'll tell you no defects. It'll tell you usually your length, your axle count, and your speed, sometimes the temperature outside. It'll tell you everything over the radio as you go by, and it scans in. Usually those are every 15 or 20 miles along the way. And ever since the railroads have been trying to implement their precision scheduled railroading model, which is essentially a model to give more money to Wall Street and to gut the railroad as much as they can, to contribute the absolute minimum, and then all of the employees and all of the people that work there have to provide more work with less.
I was going to say that sounds like corporate speak to me. So
yes, it is. That's exactly what it is. And I would say it's, they call it precision scheduled railroading. I would say it's not precision, it's not schedule, and it's not even railroading. So it's a lie on every sense of the word. So as part of that, they've tried to eliminate delays, and they don't want these detectors calling out, oh, there's a hot wheel. Now the train has to stop and the crew has to get out and inspect. And it costs time, and especially with them running these 12, 13, 14,000 foot trains now, if you have to stop that train and now you're blocking an entire community and an ambulance can't get through. And it's so the railroads have been, instead of trying to address the issue by maybe shortening trains, maybe inspecting them more, they don't want to do that because they're cutting their maintenance staff. What they've been doing is they've just been shutting off these exit messages and making it to where these messages go back to the headquarters of the railroad, and some guy sitting in a cubicle looks up the information and decides whether the train should stop. Meanwhile, the crew on the train has no idea. And that's come out. And what has also come out is that these detectors are not federally regulated. There is no federal regulation. So that is why states right now are trying to impose standards on these detectors. So like Nevada, Assembly Bill 456, which is sitting on the governor's desk right now. We'll see whether it actually gets signed into law. I played a little bit of a part making a video for the hearings on that. So we'll see if that actually passes out. Of course, the railroad was there in testimony. Union Pacific, the attorney, he threatened to sue over it and saying, well, you guys don't have any jurisdiction as a state. And he didn't even refer to the right state. He referred to it as East Palestine, Texas in the hearing, which I thought was just hilarious. So he didn't even know what state it was in. There's no standards.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's a pretty direct connection between a privatized system and then just complete lack of oversight and profit motives that are the exact opposite of the motives that we would want for protecting the economy, protecting people's lives in the communities, protecting the safety of the workers who are on the train, and the integrity of the these are people operating the trains who don't even know what their safety standard is as they're rolling down the tracks. And when you said the rails, not just the not the whole railway system, but the rails themselves, the track has been mostly privatized in the United States for our history. I thought, well, it's such an obvious situation where you can't have competition. It's impossible to imagine markets in actual rails, right? You're not going to put multiple rails next to each other. You're not going to, blast extra passages through mountains to have multiple actual tracks competing with each other. It just makes
no
sense
one time, though.
whatsoever. Oh, they did.
Did they?
Of course, it's America. Oh, yeah. I should.
There's plenty of examples of that. I mean, a good example of that would have been like the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific and the Milwaukee Road up in Montana and Idaho and Washington State. At one time, there was a lot of competition, but this is also before the interstate highway system and all of the public alternatives to augment transportation. And so a lot of those lines have been ripped up, abandoned, and you don't have that competition anymore, the mergers. And that it was, you can't reverse history there. Right. And at one time, the government was subsidizing the construction, not just the federal government, but states and localities everywhere wanted to have a railroad. And so they were subsidizing these companies to come in here and build. And for a lot of decades, they built, and they ended up actually overbuilding at one time. They built too many railroads. So by the time the 1890s came around and they saw a major economic crisis, lots of railroads actually went bankrupt during the 1890s, and including Union Pacific Railroad. They went bankrupt in the 1890s, and they were bought at auction by E.H. Harriman, because back then we didn't believe in bailing out corporations that failed. We believed in letting them reorganize and reconsolidate and actually have some accountability. And that is how you have accountability in a market. If you run your company into the ground, you go out of business and someone takes over your company. And
we haven't seen that for a while here.
we don't have that anymore. So how can we claim to have any free market solutions in rail at all when there is no free market in rail?
Right. And it just seems like such an obvious public utility, public good with massive public implications, that there's a public interest in having these publicly regulated, publicly monitored, and should be publicly owned, because it just doesn't make sense for a private market. And the parallels to our health insurance system should be pretty obvious to most people. When you look at the situation in health insurance, we say the best solution is to take the profit motive out of the equation altogether. We should just have one publicly funded, publicly accountable Medicare for all system, since competition doesn't work that well in health insurance or healthcare for that matter as well. Very similar with hospitals. Most places in the country, it doesn't make sense to have more than one hospital competing with each other. And when you're sick, you're not really in a good position to choose anyway. So tell us about this campaign that Railroad Workers United is involved with, to actually try and win public ownership of the railroad infrastructure, which I think that's the direction we really need to be going in, similar to the Medicare for All movement.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is the direction that needs to be going in, for the same reason that you cite for like Medicare for All. When you're diagnosed with cancer, you don't have the opportunity to go and say, well, I'm going to go comparison shop at some other hospitals. So that undermines any market motivation there, and the same thing goes with the railroads. And it's not even, you can call it public ownership. It would relate to open access of the rails is kind of actually what I don't want to call it nationalization or anything, because that's not what it would be. We're not, like, when I've had this discussion with people, a lot of people are like, whoa, what, you just want Amtrak to just run all the freight in the country and have some government bureaucracy? That's not what we're talking about at all. We're more talking about, a well-maintained rail system that is open access for all, where if you want to go and start a railroad and operate it on these open access tracks, you could do that. Right now, what essentially the system that we have now is where duopolies control these tracks and prevent access and prevent competition and stifle their customers. A lot of the customers that just flat have it because they flat out don't have it because the railroads will actually eliminate customers that are not profitable enough for them, or they won't invest in expanding their infrastructure, because why would you expand it if you could just raise your rates on your existing customers and have fewer customers and not have to invest in the tracks? So yeah, the idea is that the rail system should be treated almost like our interstate highway system. And our interstate highway system has thousands of functioning trucking companies. And regardless of, it's not saying that it's perfect. There's problems as well. But we have a functional trucking system in the United States, and they all share this common infrastructure. No one's suggesting that Swift should go and own an interstate.
Right.
Of course, I don't. Of course, that's probably a bad example. Anyone that's worked in the trucking industry knows that Swift probably shouldn't own anything.
Right.
You know,
there's some marketing guy at Swift who's like, maybe we should be trying to own the road.
Right.
Great idea.
Yeah. So no one's suggesting that a trucking company should own a highway.
Yep.
But yet that's what happens in the railroad industry. And because that's going on, they can block out competition. And so what we want is a functional, growing, modernizing rail system. And if the system is publicly owned in that sort of manner, largely where the tracks are maintained and rented out to private companies, and also government, railroad companies, if a state wanted to have one, just rent it out, then that gives opportunity for us to focus on, like, for example, the environmental issue. It's a whole lot easier to electrify the U.S. rail system than it is to build millions of electric vehicle charging stations for cars.
Ooh, good point.
It is a lot easier, and the amount of the amount of carbon saved would be immense from that, because you have all of these trains right now that burn diesel, that when they're going down long miles and miles of grades, they could be regenerating, putting that power back into the grid, but instead they're just wasting it as heat going out the stack. It's wasting energy. But these railroads, as long as they're privately held, they're not going to invest in that. They're not going to invest in electrification,
because they're not like the people like you who grew up of like. You said you grew up like wanting to work on the railroad, like wanting to build like a future for this country, right? That includes railroads and that uses railroads to make this the most modern and successful country it can be, right? These corporate assholes, they're really just looking for a payout, right? Like there's no...
They could... They could care less if the railroad even exists in 10 years, just as long as they were able to buy back their $6 billion in shares last quarter.
Right.
So... there was a time, and you can see it. You can do a YouTube search, and you can look up some of these old videos put out by these railroads in the 40s and 50s. And okay, maybe they can say, okay, that's just corporate propaganda. But these railroads did used to put out, PR videos about what they were doing to make their railroads better and faster and safer and more efficient. And there's one that I love. It's called Better Way for the Santa Fe. And it was put out in 1959. And it was a section of track through the mountains in Arizona that they rerouted in that time. And it was one of the last great rail infrastructure projects funded by private companies like this. And they went in and they blasted out using heavy equipment, and they blasted out this brand new line through the Arizona Divide between, where Flagstaff and Kingman and Williams and that in Arizona. So out there, very, very rugged area. And the original line built in the 1890s was really windy and curvy and had narrow clearances and slow. and they blasted out this brand new line down there and made it to where passenger trains could run through there consistently the entire way at 90 miles an hour in 1959.
Damn.
And they put essentially the way I've been kind of trying to calculate how much it was. It's basically the equivalent of about $250 million is what it would cost in today's money, is what they spent on doing this project. Meanwhile, in today's money, Union Pacific bought back $6 billion worth of shares last year. So imagine all that they could be investing into the betterment and the sustainability of their railroad in the future.
Yeah.
But companies don't do that anymore. They could care less if the companies,
dividends.
Yes. And then when that carcass has been picked clean, they'll move on to another industry.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Bless you.
Yes.
Bless you again.
My allergies are killing me.
I was just gonna say it is allergy time everywhere. So we spend a lot of our time trying to take a really complicated issue that a lot of people think of as being political and trying to, this is Medicare for All, we're trying to boil it down into its simplest terms and explain it to folks who already have their own kind of preconceptions about the way that corporations work and the way that governments work and whatever. So you spend a lot of your time just talking to people. Ooh, bless you again. You spend a lot of time just talking to people about again, a very complicated issue that many people have some political preconceptions about, and et cetera, et cetera. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry, I'm totally ruining the podcast right now.
It's all good. It's all good. So, I mean, I guess my question is, like, what have you found are the best strategies for talking to people about this, right? When you talk to your coworkers about this issue, how do you boil it down in a way that folks can understand and that folks might find appealing, even if they are a little bit maybe suspicious of government or, something like that?
Yes. As they should be suspicious of government. And I'm not one of those people that are blindly just believing that the government is the most competent organization for doing things.
Sure.
But neither are corporations. And I really believe that if you're going to preach capitalism or markets or competition, then there has to be the opportunity for failure. You can't be too big to fail. You can't receive preferential loans from the Federal Reserve. You can't rely on low interest rate monetary policy to buy back your own shares. You can't receive bailouts when you should go bankrupt. There needs to be an opportunity for failure. And the railroads don't have an opportunity for failure, and there is no competition. So if we're looking at who would be more competent to handle such a structure, I would say that probably, as much as the government has its shortcomings, the U.S. government not operating for a profit would probably be a better way to actually maintain this infrastructure, because otherwise they're going to use this infrastructure. These private companies are going to use the infrastructure as they're going to be using it incentive to attract share buybacks and dividends to the best they can, even if it means putting us in a precarious situation in other ways in our transportation system, environmentally, like I said, with electrification of the railroads, or even just taxpayer-wise development. So you look at our roads, for example. So if the railroads decide we are not going to expand our infrastructure, we are not going to add more double track, and we're going to constrain customers because supply and demand will keep rail supply tight, and that is what they're doing. They're keeping rail supply short and tight so that they can raise rates on the existing captive shippers. Key, they like captive shippers. So all the shippers that would go to rail at that point are going to taxpayer-funded, subsidized highway systems. So the taxpayers are funding their buybacks and their dividends. So, and anyone whether you are on the left and just believe that this should be done by the government anyway, or you're someone that considers yourself to be, responsible or fiscally conservative or whatever, no one should agree that it is not responsible to use taxpayer dollars to either bail out or help line the pockets or protect an industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happening. And we are protecting the railroad industry by giving them the highway backstop to kick all their undesirable customers that they don't like over to the subsidized highway system.
Right. And as you said, the federal government is already playing a role in maintaining that interstate highway system and is not doing a terribly incompetent job. I'm sure there's criticisms of that as well. But and
they're doing a pretty good job.
And I was struck by what you said about how, by allowing these private rail companies to kind of own track, they're basically allowed to just extort the rest of the industry, right? It's like it's private extortion is their model of capitalism right now, I think. So,
Paul, sorry, go on.
Oh, and just using the taxpayers to backstop any of their losses.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say.
All I was going to say is that I find you very persuasive, so I can see why these big railroad companies are a little bit afraid of you. I can see why you're making them nervous.
The retaliation.
Because you have taught me a lot over the past half hour, and I'm ready to go.
And if listeners want to learn more about this, how would they find Railroad Workers United and learn more about the campaign to make rails open access, as you say, or public ownership?
Public ownership.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there a website folks can go to learn more, or you can plug your own pages too?
They can. Well, yeah, they can do Google search for Railroad Workers United for sure and see what we're doing. Get to the website. There's also, Facebook group and we're constantly putting out information on the industry and also trying to connect ourselves with other organizations that also seem to have similar desires to make our country and workers actually have a better future, better working conditions and everything. As far as me, I mean, I've put out my own content. I also have my TikTok page. I was calling out corruption, but since I don't technically work for the railroad anymore, I changed it to a railroad refugee as I kind of travel around the country and make some videos and speak out, as I can a little bit. But we'll see what happens with the retaliation suit.
Yes.
Can't really talk to that, but
keep us posted, please. Absolutely.
I was just trying to sign up for your TikTok page, and some random TikTok video started playing in the background in the middle of our recording. So that was probably some weird loud outburst you heard in the middle. But I'll follow you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. I threw up Railroad Workers United website on for folks who are watching on social media, not listening. If you're listening, it's www.railroadworkersunited.org. You can learn more. I also want to close by just thanking our podcast team, without whom we couldn't make this whole podcast. Our podcast manager is Angelique Davis. Our show notes writer was Jerry Katz, and our audio editor for this episode was Christian Brandt. So, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to the Medicare for All podcast on your favorite platform. And this show is a project of the Healthcare Now Education Fund. And if you want to support our work, you can donate at our website, healthcare-now.org. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Stay safe and stay dangerous.